There you go.
Mic's on. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Tonight is October 13th, 2022. The 7 p.m. Rent Control Board meeting is about to start. I'd like to call a meeting to order. May I have a roll call vote, please?
Vote or attendance?
Yes. Commissioner Torosis,
Here.
Commissioner Leslie,
Here.
Commissioner Gonska,
Here.
Vice Chair Foster,
Here.
Chair Duran.
I am here. Now, may we all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'd like to request approval of the minutes. Would anybody like to make a motion?
I move to approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Okay.
Second.
Been a first and a second. Can we have a roll call vote?
Yes. Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Commissioner Gonska,
Yes.
Commissioner Torosis,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
Chair Duran.
Yes.
Question, do we need, that was for Zoom. We used to do it by a voice vote, the simple things like that, when we were on the dais in the past, and we changed it to a roll call vote during Zoom world, Blue Jeans world. Do we need to keep doing that? What do you think?
We've always done the approval of the minutes by a voice vote like that, not as a group, so that he can distinguish who votes no. So.
Okay. Moving on then to item number 6, special agenda items. Are there any special agenda items?
Yes, I have a couple things this evening. Good evening, commissioners. And I want to welcome everybody back to the council chambers and the people who are with us. It's nice to be back in person after 2.5 years on virtual meetings, so nice to be back together. I did want to mention about the Rent Control Adjustment Relief Program. As you know, the city has funding available to assist people with the 6% rent increase this year. The application period expired on September 19th. At that point, approximately 570 applications were received. They're processing those now. They expect within the next couple of weeks to be able to notify tenants and property owners about the results of the individual applications, and hopefully checks will be going out shortly after that. It does require property owners to provide a W-9 form to the city, so that's one of the things that the staff who are processing these applications are requesting. They also, in some cases, have to get additional documentation from the tenants who submitted the applications. There are various staff members throughout the city who are assisting with the processing of the application because of the sensitive timeliness of it, including one of our information coordinators who's working on that. The other thing I wanted to mention is since we last met in person, we went live with our new database system. And a very important component of that is the public portal, the civics portion that allows property owners and tenants to submit applications and forms online. So we went live with that portion of the database in May, and we've established 760 accounts. I think that's a good number after just 5 months. Of those, 600 plus are property owners, about 160 are tenants' accounts. And those owners are associated with the properties that they own, or management companies are associated with the properties that they manage. And so that represents about 1,550 properties. And we've received so far about 775 tenancy registrations through the system. So that will help us with efficiency. And so I'm very pleased with that after the first 5 months. And Mr. Costello is really the leader on the civics platform. So I want to thank him as well for good work on that. Commissioner Troses.
Thanks. On the 760 accounts that were created, how are you driving people to create them? Is it just sending folks an email and asking them to create an account? Or like, how did we get that many? And then when you say tenancy registrations, I assume that people are registering for new tenancies
Right.
and that the older tenancies, we still have some paper record of that.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those are also reflected in the system.
Right.
But yes, these are new registrations of new tenancies that are established.
But the 760 accounts, how did people know to go to create an account here?
Mr. Costello, do you want to address that?
Like, I guess for public watching, why would one want an account? Where would they go? How are we getting them there?
Sure. So we initially introduced it in our newsletter, our spring newsletter, and then we reiterated the opportunity to have an account in our summer mailings to all owners and tenants. And then the information coordinators who talk with property owners let them know that that's available and that if they have a tendency to register, that that's the ideal way to do it. So that's how we're driving people to it.
Got it. Okay. That would make sense. Yeah.
And her other question was the benefits. of
Yeah.
submitting
Why
folks
would, if I'm watching at home right now, why would I want to create an account?
Thank you for asking that, actually. So since all the users have a dashboard, once they set up their account, they can see all of the forms that they have filed. They can sort them by property. If they're a property manager, for example, they can sort them by a particular property address. But the form also tells them at what the status is in terms of processing within our agency, so they can know if there's something in an intake review, or if there may be an issue with it, we can communicate with them through the system to resolve the issue, rather than sending paper back and forth. We allow all these different types of forms to be filed online, so there is no need to send in original signatures and things like that on documents. So it's a much more efficient way to work. They also can receive their annual registration fee bill through their civics portal. They can view their annual MAR report. It becomes an attachment or a downloadable attachment to their bill. And the same thing with any of the tenancy registration forms that they file or other forms. They become a PDF that the owner can download or save or print. So it's just like paper. If they still want to work in the paper world and keep files, they can do that with the system. But if they're more efficient and want to do things, electronically, it allows them to do that. They can use their cell phone to file a tenancy registration form. So a lot of advantages.
Cool. Thank you.
Go ahead, Commissioner Troses, or sorry, Foster.
Back to your first point, I've had a couple of constituents contact me who missed the deadline. I realized that program was organized a certain way, but are there any other agencies of the city, or private or otherwise, who are providing any relief or opportunities for relief if someone missed the deadline?
The number of applications that they received was lower than what they had anticipated. So there is a possibility after they work through these applications that they will consider reopening. There's no official decision about that. They need to work through the applications that they've received first. For senior citizens who have lived in their units since at least 2000, there's another program, the Preserving Our Diversity Program, POD, and that's available to low-income or very low-income seniors to provide stability for them. So if they're interested, it provides a subsidy to subsidize their rent and make sure they have sufficient funds after paying their rent for the other expenses, the other living expenses. So anybody who has questions about that can certainly call our office or email us or come in, and we will help direct them to resources.
Okay, anything else from anyone? All right, thank you very much. we're going to move then to public comment. Item number 7, for the general public, this is an opportunity to address the board on issues that are within the jurisdiction of this body. However, we cannot comment on anything that is said. Secretary Ho, is there any requests to speak?
There are no requests to speak.
Okay. Thank you very much. Then we're closing public comment, and we'll move straight into item number 10, jurisdictional items. The first one we have is item 10A1, which is case D5295. The address is 2628 6th Street, number 5, appellant Barbara Bills and WIB Holdings, LLC. May we have a staff report?
Good evening, Commissioners. Mr. Finisi, who is the tenant in this matter, notified his landlord back in September of 2021 of various maintenance conditions that existed in his unit and requested their repair and said that if they weren't going to be repaired, then he would file a notice, a petition for a rent decrease, which is the procedure he has to follow under the board's regulations. And the landlord did not respond to that request, and so in October 28th, Mr. Finisi filed a rent decrease petition with the board. On November 4th, staff emailed to the landlord, Ms. Barbara Bills, the copy of the petition, the fact that it had been filed, as well as a scheduled mediation to help resolve the matter. And this was sent by email to the email that was provided by the tenant as the email for the landlord. A week later, the agency sends another email to the same address telling Ms. Bills that just to confirm that you're going to be attending the mediation. Ms. Bills then responds to that email and states that she is on the property making repairs and she'll contact the board within a few days. And staff follows up with Ms. Bills, and she states that she can't make that mediation, so they reschedule it. They notify her again of the rescheduled date and by email, and she responds from that same email that she cannot make that date. This mediation is rescheduled a total of 4 times, the last time being in January of 11th of 2022. And at that point, as pursuant to the board's regulations, it's forwarded to a hearing. The notice for the hearing is emailed to Ms. Bills, and then on the morning of the hearing, another courtesy email is sent to Ms. Bills, but she doesn't appear for the hearing, and she doesn't offer any evidence to refute the tenant's claims. Based on the record, the hearing officer issues a decision and grants rent decreases based on what was proved by the tenant. In her appeal, Ms. Bills claims that she was never notified of the conditions for which the petitioner received a rent decrease. The record, however, doesn't support her claim, and for that reason, staff recommends that the board affirm the hearing officer's decision and the findings of facts and conclusions of law in that decision.
Okay, are there any comments from commissioners regarding the staff report?
Do we have any folks to testify?
Do we have any persons requesting to speak? Secretary Ho?
No, there's been no request to speak on this item.
Okay. There being no request to speak, we can move straight into either questions or discussion by the commissioners. Looks like Commissioner Trosis, did you have?
Yeah, so just to clarify, to put a pin on it, it's $118 a month rent credit that they've received. And now now Ms. Bills is appealing any sort of decrease on the grounds that she never received the notification of the hearing in the first place.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Vice Chair Foster?
This agency has been in place for 42 years. We have processes that have been pretty demonstrated to work fairly well. And this landlord did not avail themselves of our process. And I don't find any error in the staff report whatsoever in the findings of the hearings department. So I, for one, am going to be voting to affirm this case.
Okay, and I would also like to add that, you know, as an appellate body in this case, we are here. We can change if there's been what we see as clearly erroneous decision on the part of the hearing officer. To me, the hearing officer's decision was a reasonable one. Therefore, I too would recommend that I will vote to affirm the hearing officer's decision. I'll entertain a motion unless any other commissioners would like to make comment.
Okay.
Chair Foster, go ahead.
I move that we affirm the decision,
Okay, there's a first, any
deny the
seconds?
appeal.
And adopt the findings of fact and conclusions of law.
That is a second by Commissioner
Yep,
Trosas.
second.
Okay, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Gonska,
Yes.
Commissioner Torosis,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, moving on to item 10A2. It's case number D5296. Let me just make sure. Before COVID, and I was at the dais, I only had one pair of glasses. Now I have two, so getting old. Okay, so the case is D5296. The address is 838 Lincoln Boulevard, number 2. The appellant is Schlafman Family Living Trust et al. May we have a staff report, please?
Yes, Commissioners, in this matter, the tenant, Mr. Tawatawe, filed a rent decrease petition alleging various maintenance conditions, which included damaged wall and ceiling surfaces and paint in his unit. The parties went into mediation, and in mediation, they entered an agreement, and under that agreement, the landlord agreed to evaluate cracks and make any necessary repairs throughout the unit. And the agreement set a deadline of January 3rd, 2022. The landlord, after the mediation agreement was reached, the landlord's agents sought to limit the repairs to certain walls in certain rooms in the unit. And the parties were unable to resolve their differences as to the scope of the repairs. Therefore, pursuant to Board Regulation 4006C, because the parties were unable to resolve all their differences, the matter was forwarded to a hearing. And that matter was referred to hearing in March of 2022. In the appeal, the landlord argues that there should have been no hearing since the parties had been able to reach an agreement and the landlord's repairman had in fact evaluated cracks and, according to the landlord, made the necessary repairs. But the agreement that was entered into was to make necessary repairs throughout the unit. And the landlord's agent sought to limit the repairs to certain walls and certain rooms. And the parties were unable to resolve those differences well past the deadline that was set in the agreement. So the matter was properly forwarded to a hearing. At the hearing, a hearing investigator's report showed discolored and damaged paint with scuffs, cracks, and bulges on wall and ceiling surfaces throughout the unit. And it also was established that the unit hadn't been painted in about 35 to 40 years. In the appeal, and as well as in the hearing, the landlord argued that the tenant had failed to provide access for the repairs. What the record showed was that back in December of 2021, when the landlord's repairman was sent to fix the unit, he limited repairs to certain rooms, and no ceiling was cracked, and the tenant did not want painting to proceed because he didn't want a piecemeal approach to this, and he didn't think that it made sense to proceed in the manner that was being proposed. In March of 22, the landlord's agent again contacted the tenant to be let in to continue with repairs, and there was again a disagreement about the scope of the necessary repairs. And apparently, what the record also shows is that in the following week, the landlord sent a couple more emails from the agent, and in which they said they agreed to expand the repairs to certain ceilings in the unit. The tenant said that he didn't understand those emails, and he was unaware of the additional repairs that were being proposed, because that had not been something that had even been mentioned in a conversation the week prior with the landlord's agent. The hearing officer found that there was confusion and disagreement between the parties as to the scope of the necessary repairs, and there was not an intentional denial of access by the tenant. That finding is supported by substantial evidence in the record. And given the condition of the walls and the fact that the unit hadn't been painted in over 3 decades, the hearing officer granted a rent decrease, and also as a condition of compliance with the decision required the painting of walls and surfaces that were damaged throughout the unit. And there is substantial evidence in the record that supports that finding as well. This body is an appellate body, and so it should affirm the hearing officer's findings and decision if they're reasonably supported by substantial evidence, which they are in this case. And for that reason, staff recommends that the board affirm the decision and the decision's findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Ho, are there any requests to speak?
Yes, there's been a request to speak by Alex Schlafman.
Okay. Yes, you can. And before you start, I want to ask the commissioners, do you have any questions regarding the staff report before he speaks? Seeing none? Okay.
I don't have questions, but would I be able to see the record with the pictures? Do you have it? Okay, that's fine. All right, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks. You know I like the
adjusting to the
pictures.
new.
You know we love our pictures.
Okay, so that being said, when you're ready, you only have 5 minutes. Is that correct, Secretary Ho? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, commissioners, and thank you for allowing me to speak. However, I think the way that the attorney, I apologize more to say, is that correct? Has described the events that I think is wholly inaccurate and from many respects. And I think that we should kind of back up a little bit. And the way I would start is that this matter was referred to mediation and the parties agreed. And a settlement agreement was reached. And for the most part, there were a few, I think there were, part of the petition were 10 items. They were reduced, the petitioner, I think, withdrew about 4 of them. It was reduced down to 5. The 5 items then were agreed upon between the parties to do the repairs. The landlord did the repairs of 4 items, and the only 1 item that was left that was really the subject of the hearing was related to the paint. And I will read, a settlement agreement was reached, and what for the most part what we're referring to is about with regard to the paint. The settlement agreement reads, damaged wall or ceiling surface, including paint, wallpaper, plaster, drywall, or wood trim. That's how it's described in the petition. That's one of the areas. And it says, owner agrees to have vendor evaluate all cracks throughout the unit, and if necessary, vendor will patch and paint those areas. That was what was agreed to between the petitioner and the landlord. That was the limited scope of the work that was required to be done. The landlord had a painter come and patch those areas. And in fact, an inspection was done in support of the hearing, in anticipation of the hearing, and they find that those areas were patched. However, the petitioner then said, I want my entire apartment repainted. The owner said, well, I can't agree, that's not what we agreed to. And that was not even part of the original petition. In fact, if you go review the petition, it was never even requested by the petitioner. So when at the hearing, the findings of the hearing officer to request that the entire of the apartment be repainted was outside, 1, the scope of the petition, and also beyond the settlement agreement that was agreed to between the parties. And so if you read the staff report and the recommendation, effectively what he's asking the commissioners to do is completely disregard the settlement agreement that's reached. And in fact, part of the staff report is saying that that the hearing officers, the commissioners here, do not have to follow the settlement agreement that was reached. And that's really what this matter is about. If the parties agree to a settlement agreement, or should the parties be bound to that settlement agreement? And I believe that they should. The owner was responsible to evaluate cracks throughout and paint as necessary. The owner patched and then was not allowed to perform that repair. The hearing officer, however, on their own asked for the apartment to be repainted, bearing in mind the petitioner never requested the entire apartment. He wanted only his living room and kitchen areas to be repainted, never requested that the bedrooms be entered into, never even allowed the landlord to enter into the bedrooms at all. So the decision of the hearing officer was beyond the petition, beyond the scope of the request of the petitioner, and was outside the settlement agreement that's reached by the parties. I defer my time if anyone wants to ask any questions.
I do have a question for you. The part that you quoted, could you reread that again? And I think it was the part about what the hearing officer said. There was a couple of sentences there.
I apologize. I'm not sure. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, there was a part that you quoted.
I think I only quoted from the settlement agreement. The settlement agreement reads that owner agrees to have vendor evaluate all cracks throughout the unit, and if necessary, vendor will patch and paint those areas. That's what was agreed to by the parties in the settlement agreement. I'm holding a copy right now.
Okay, and my question, okay, so then the other part of my question is, what did it say? What was the petition? What was the language in the petition?
Oh, the petition, the way it works, if you review the petitions, they're specific. They're box check marks. And one of those sections says damaged wall or ceiling surface, including paint, wallpaper, plaster, drywall, or wood trim. That's when a petitioner chooses to say that there's damage done in certain areas, that is checked. And so in all the different sections of the settlement agreement, they're described by those areas, by what was the check mark of the conditions.
Okay, so there's a check mark with general statements, and then you
Yes.
check it if it applies.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much.
Got you. I got it. Any other questions?
Yeah, I do have some.
Go ahead, Commissioner
So
Brooks.
just to clarify, because I'm reading the hearing officer's decision here, the settlement agreement was reached before or after the hearing?
Oh, I was reached before the hearing.
So why would you proceed with the hearing if you'd reached a settlement? Why wouldn't the tenant have dismissed the entire case?
Because the petitioner said that he wanted the matter to go forward.
Right, so you're saying you reached a settlement on all matters. Why would you not adhere to the settlement agreement? But did you not go forward with the hearing anyway?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
I mean, maybe the question's more for our counsel, but why would you, I'm just confused about your line of reasoning as to why you're holding out the settlement agreement to be like the dispositive issue. If you agreed to that settlement agreement, knowing that the tenant was not going to release you of all claims and that you still needed to go forward with the hearing.
It's very common for settlement agreements to require a certain course of action. More often than not, settlement agreements agree whether it's a payment or a certain work to be performed. And then that work was, the scope of work that was supposed to be done was agreed to by the parties. It's the petition that wouldn't allow that work to go forward. By all accounts, we're asking for the settlement agreement to be enforced.
Right, but I hear what you're saying, but I just don't know that I agree with that line of reasoning.
Then I guess then the line of reasoning would be that no settlement agreement should be enforced that requires any course of conduct to go forward.
Sure, but typically I get that.
Is that what we're agreeing to?
Yeah, but I'm actually looking at the maintenance related conditions on page 6 that you went forward with. Well, I'm actually looking at page 6. And one of them was the damaged wall or ceiling surface, including paint, wallpaper, plaster, drywall, or wood trim. So I would think that that would be within the hearing officer's discretion to determine if the entire unit needed to be painted, would it not be?
It would be within the hearing officer's discretion if it wasn't agreed to in the settlement agreement to limit the scope of that.
Okay.
The settlement agreement agreed to what the scope would be. If the parties agreed to say that we should paint one wall, does that mean that the commissioner should then disregard what the parties agreed to and say the entire unit should be repainted? Then in that case, why have any party agree to any settlement agreement at all? Why have the parties, why encourage mediation and encourage settlement?
Okay, I appreciate you answering the questions.
Any other questions for the speaker? All right, sir, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for your time.
Are there any other requests to speak, Secretary Hill?
No, there are no further requests to speak on this item.
Okay, I'd like to move this into discussion. And are there any commissioners? I saw Vice Chair Foster first, and then Commissioner Trosas.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at page 16 of the staff report, withdrawn issues, number 9 and number 10. You can see, per the settlement agreement during that mediation, that these things were agreed upon and withdrawn. However, remaining issues, number 11, are before the hearing officer. So it seems pretty clear to me that even though there was some confusion on all parties' parts, that confusion caused it to be kicked forward on item number 11, which is exactly the item we're talking about. And also, you know, the number one question I get, honestly, from constituents is about paint and carpet all the time. How many years? Is it true that in 10 years I can ask, you know, there's all these rumors out there about the law in California or elsewhere. And it's kind of sad that it's such a disruptive issue between landlords and tenants, and it's unfortunate. But for 35 years to go by, I can also imagine that a patch next to a dingy, dirty 35-year-old paint job is probably inadequate by our standards. So the evidence on page 16 is enough for me. While I appreciate the arguments that are made, I'm not persuaded. Thank you.
Commissioner Trosas?
Yeah, I just want to clarify with Mr. Mordezai. How often do you get settlement agreements to dispose of the entire case versus a partial settlement agreement where someone will agree to certain things and then remainder of the things will go forward? There is a distinction, correct?
Certainly. I apologize, but I don't have the statistics specific to yours, but I recall in one of Mr. Costello's reports a while back, at least, I think 70% of our petitions that are filed are disposed of through mediation.
Right.
And disposed of means exactly that.
Right.
There isn't outstanding differences following an agreement, as there was in this case, that then requires the matter to be forwarded to a hearing because there really wasn't a resolution.
Right.
And that's really what the mediation process in the board's regulations is for. It's for resolution of the differences, an informal resolution. Since that didn't happen here, it went to the hearing officer.
Thanks. You said it better than I could have. And then isn't it also true that if there's a maintenance related issue before the hearing officer, including something relating to paint, that is within the hearing officer's discretion to make a determination based on what they observed during the hearing?
So long as the landlord received notification through the petition, and so there was due process, that he was going to be facing a hearing in which there was a rent decrease based on these issues, then that would be correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other commissioners' questions? Okay, I do have a question. Looking at page 16, number 11, Mr. Mordezai, where it says maintenance-related conditions, and then there's that bullet, the first one that says damaged walls or ceiling surface, including paint, wallpaper, plaster, drywall, or wood trim. Is that the checkbox that a person would check on the petition?
That is correct. That's a ready-made checkbox that's available. In various cases, tenants then add to that. They specify things. They provide greater detail. In this case, that's what was checked off.
Okay, so based on what the speaker, the comments that he made, the argument that he put forth, it sounds to me, I'll get around to my point, but it sounds to me that based upon that bullet, he drew a more specific, detailed statement about what the settlement agreement was and was not. However, I think, and that could be a reasonable interpretation of this. What could also be a reasonable interpretation, in my view, is that this bullet point included the walls, the ceilings, the hallways, everything, because it says damaged wall or ceiling surface, including paint. And so a reasonable interpretation of this box, checkbox, could be all of that, and it goes to the point of notice. Did the landlord have notice about all that could be included? And so based on that information and the information provided, it appears to me that the hearing officer's decision was a reasonable one. It was not unreasonable. It wasn't clearly erroneous. So I feel that there would be no choice for me other than to affirm the decision. That's kind of my thinking. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they'd like to comment. Commissioner Gonska, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for articulating that so well. I definitely agree with what you say. I mean, it seems to me that the appellant's claim here is that the terms of the mediation settlement agreement were met, but clearly the tenant did not feel that that was true because it went to a hearing officer. And at that point here, we see on page 16, as you mentioned, that there are still conditions of that agreement that were not met that still remained. And at that point, the hearing officer made a determination. And I don't see any reason why that we would find that to be inappropriate, that a hearing officer was making a determination after all the terms of the mediation agreement weren't met. So I'll be voting to affirm as well.
Okay, thank you. I would like to say also that pending this decision, once this gets remedied and they go through the compliance, then the reduction in rent goes away, right? Well, assuming they comply with the terms of what's required of them pursuant to the hearing officer.
Once the repairs are made, the landlord can contact the hearings department and request a compliance verification, and then the procedure follows from there.
Okay, and then that's the reduction in rent is reinstated to what the...
That is correct.
Okay, very good. Okay, any other comments? If not, I'll entertain a motion. Go ahead, Commissioner Trozis.
I move, as you can tell by my comments, to affirm the hearing officer's decision and adopt the findings of fact and conclusions of law.
I second.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Leslie seconds. Commissioner Trozis provided the first. Can we have a roll call vote?
Yes, Commissioner Trosis,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Commissioner Gonska,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, thank you very much. We're moving on now to administrative items. And we have a guest speaker, Brian Augusta, the Rent Control Board's advocate and representative in Sacramento, to present his report on the 2021-2022 session of the California Legislature. Mr. Augusta, hello, welcome.
Hello. It's nice to see you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful to be back in person with you all. Commissioner Gonska, look forward to meeting you in person, other than across the dais. And it's great to see you all. As the chair mentioned, I'm Brian Augusta, the board's lobbyist in Sacramento. And I'm here tonight to provide a bit of an update about the happenings in the Capitol in Sacramento. I did appear before the board during its July meeting and gave you an update at that time. And a lot of the, that was during the recess, the state legislature's recess, summer recess. They reconvened in August and wrapped up their work at the end of the month, followed by the 30-day signing period that the governor had. And so a lot of the information that I provided in the July hearing about where various bills were not much has changed since then. But we have provided a written report that updates on all of the bills that we have sort of been tracking on your behalf, and provides a little bit of analysis of what has transpired since. But that part of the report is sort of short. I'm going to go over a couple of those. And then what I really wanted to do is spend a few minutes providing some context for you all about what we see coming in the year ahead. And hopefully that that too can help inform the board's decision making later in the year when we or actually next year, when we see the new bills arrive and you begin to look at what your positions are going to be on those bills. But I think there's some important themes that I'd like to highlight for the board. But first, I want to just hit a few points of note on what did happen this year. As I reported when we met in July, I think one interesting development was that in the budget, there was for the first time some money to deal with retrofits of soft story buildings, which is a continued threat of collapse during earthquakes and has been a longstanding issue here in Santa Monica and elsewhere in the region, and the need for a source of funding to retrofit those buildings. There is $250 million in the budget to do that. That money, I should note, a lot of the money in this year's budget, when you look at the total figures, if you dig a little deeper, it's over a 2-year period. This money is slated to be expended in the upcoming budget year, so that would mean that the money would go out sometime after June of next year. I don't have further details of what the plan is on that, but I wanted to note that for you. Another interesting development, one of the bills that I had previously reported on for you all was there was a proposal this year by Assemblymember Bloom that would have established for the first time in California a standard for maximum heat or maximum temperature in rental housing. So as you all know, state law has long provided a minimum temperature. In other words, during the winter months, we need to make sure that that housing meets a certain minimum temperature. Standards generally measured 3 feet above the floor, ensuring that everyone has some amount of warmth in their house. But we have never, in California, mandated the opposite, which is during the warm months that there is a maximum indoor air temperature. And in some regions in the state, the Central Valley for one, folks would leave work and come home to a home that's actually potentially hotter than even outside. And we don't have no standard on that. So Mr. Bloom had proposed that a standard be developed. That bill did not move forward, but in the budget, after that bill was shelved, there's language in a trailer bill, along with some money to the State Department of Housing, to develop a set of policy recommendations, directing HCD to develop those policy recommendations and come back to the legislature with a recommendation for a maximum indoor air temperature and how we might implement such a policy in California. So an interesting development that I think will help improve the quality of housing. On the downside, we were tracking, there weren't, as is typically the case, although there are many bills in the landlord-tenant realm that we track and discuss with you and on which the board often takes positions, there are always only a handful of bills, if any, directly on rent stabilization. But we did have 2 this year. One was by Mr. Bloom to try to further clarify that local governments can regulate tenancies in common, which is a common form of ownership following conversion of rental housing. And then also a bill that we've seen many times, which is a proposal that Senator Leno did when he was in the legislature and now more recently with Assemblymember Lee, to establish essentially a holding period under the Ellis Act that requires that a landlord own the building for at least 5 years before they access the Ellis Act. And as we talked about, those 2 bills died fairly early on, didn't even make it off the floor of the first house. And I mentioned that, I think, in part to transition to a few themes that I want to elevate for you all about what we're seeing for next year. The first thing is that we're going to see a lot of new faces in Sacramento. Something like 25% of the seats in both houses, the Senate and the Assembly, will turn over, and almost all of those folks are going to be holding that seat for the first time in statewide office. And so that's a lot of new faces in Sacramento, and they obviously bring divergent experiences and divergent experience in terms of their experience legislating. So we're going to need, we the people, those of us in Sacramento who engage with legislators are going to need to build new relationships, and we're going to need to have conversations with them about rent stabilization and the issues that tenants and landlords face. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see, who are the new leaders and who are the new champions on various issues that I know are important to the board. And hopefully we will see some of these new faces really take on that leadership. The other sort of, something that's not new is that I think we will continue to see that housing and homelessness are going to be a top priority for both the governor and the legislature. If you look at the website of just about anyone who's running for any of those seats, you will see that housing or homelessness is usually among the top issues that they're talking about. And we have had the good fortune over the last several years that we have had a very significant budget surplus. And although, as I noted in our July meeting, the legislature and governor this time did not put quite as much money towards affordable housing and homelessness as they have in prior years, we still saw significant investments. And that's a product of having a record surplus, a surplus that's so enormous that it may trigger some arcane budget requirements that could have potentially pushed money back to taxpayers or caused it to spill over into other programs. And so this year, we don't have an official assessment yet, but the rumor is that we're actually looking now at a potential deficit. So obviously those pictures will change between now and January, when we will get the governor's first official budget and projections, and certainly going into May when we see the April tax receipts. But we may be heading into it's been anticipated for some time that eventually we will see a downturn. Eventually these numbers will not be as rosy as they've been. And so, we may be soon reaching that time. But it's also important to keep in mind that this governor and the legislature, but the governor in particular, like his predecessor, have long said that, even when we are in a surplus, we need to be conservative about spending, which is why we're seeing only one-time spending commitments for the most part, rather than ongoing. And so I think we may see a more conservative approach to budgeting, at least from the governor this year, but we'll see. The other theme that we've talked about quite a bit here is the impact that the pandemic has had on renters and on landlords, but particularly the risk that renters would see displacement. And so during the pandemic, we have seen a lot of important renter protections, both at the state and local and even federal level. Many of those are now expiring. And so what will that mean for policymaking in Sacramento with those tenant protections expiring? Is there a weariness among policymakers who have, in my opinion, many of the tenant protections that we were able to enact at the state level really did do the job of ensuring that people could stay housed and not face eviction for non-payment of rent. And they've largely worked, and we deployed resources somewhat slowly, somewhat unevenly to shore that up, but we've done that at the state level. So is there a weariness around additional tenant protections, or will we see continued emphasis on enacting additional protections? I think that is yet to be seen. My sense is that there is a bit of issue fatigue, and yet we know that rents are continuing to rise. We know that evictions are also beginning again to rise. And so how will that inform policymaking? We will see, but I know that that will be a continued part of the conversation. And as an example, as noted in the report, none of them made it to the governor's desk, but we did see quite a few bills in this area. One consistent theme was around access to housing, right? There was about 4 or 5 bills that looked at the question of what is appropriate to look at in terms of screening with respect to criminal background checks, about credit reports, about just the basic ability to access screening reports, And there was one bill that passed that attempts to make that easier for tenants to get past that initial hurdle. So with all those bills dying, I think we're likely to see that issue continue in Sacramento to be a theme, and we'll probably see more bills on that along with landlord-tenant issues. As a final note, more and more local jurisdictions are joining Santa Monica and other longstanding jurisdictions who have a rent stabilization ordinance. Seeing more and more, particularly in this region, adopting some form of rent stabilization. I think in the view of many, that reflects a growing concern about rapidly increasing rents and the impacts that that has on the stability of our communities. But it also has a dimension with respect to state policymaking. For many years, policies like Ellis and Costa-Hawkins Act have a very narrow sort of constituency in the state legislature. It's mostly a handful of legislators who represent Santa Monica or portions of LA or San Francisco, rather than the full body. But as more and more jurisdictions enact some form of rent stabilization, I suspect we will see increasing awareness among policymakers about these policies, and we will likely see increasing concern about ensuring that those policies can function effectively at the local level. So it's not going to change overnight. It's not like it's some significant revolution in the thinking of the state legislature on these issues, but I think we are going to see a shift of sorts in terms of the geography of which legislators care about issues like Costa-Hawkins and Ellis, but also policies like the Tenant Protection Act that close some of those gaps as well. So I'm gonna close there, but I think those are some significant themes that we're expecting to see next year in terms of budget and policymaking in Sacramento that impact the work of the board. So I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman, see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, Vice Chair Foster had some questions for you.
Thank you, Brian. So nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Our property owners around here are incredibly interested in seismic retrofit issues. Over the years since we've had the program in place, when I'm walking my neighborhoods, I've seen many, many, many retrofits happening, occurring with my neighbors. I'm seeing signage, for the companies who performed it. That's great. And I would point out that they were supposed to do it 30 years ago, but they're doing it now, some of them who didn't do it 30 years ago. For those who have already done it, is there any provision or retroactive relief in that bill for the people who have complied but happened to have complied before this bill? Should it make it through?
Well, it is in the budget, so it's enacted. The policy prescriptions in there are pretty thin, being left up to further development by the implementing authority. I don't recall, though, that it provides for retroactive. I will double check, but I think.
So is it income? I mean, what are the parameters for is it need-based? Is it income-based? Is it level of rent collection in these buildings? Like, what would qualify
My recollection is that
an owner?
It directs them to develop some criteria based on, in part, need related to both geography and the need of the landlords. In other words, to ensure that the resources are prioritized first for those areas where where there's less likely to be the resources to do it on their own.
Okay. And $30 million for eviction defense. I've worked on the right to counsel issue here for a couple of years. And while I'm glad that that's there, I see vastly larger amounts of money being awarded to other programs that might not be as imperative and timely as an eviction defense. As we know, it's been proven that in 96% of the cases wherein the tenant had representation, they avoided eviction and some alternative resolution of their case. And so I wonder, I know what the flavor was for the LA City Council and LA County folks for the local program before COVID hit and messed with everyone's budgets. However, because we were about to enact it here and instead it's on a smaller scope, what is the temperature at the state level for making this a bigger priority?
Yeah, I'm hoping that that is, I mean, I know that, that among the constituencies that advocated for that money, that is, once again, next year, they will be pushing to ensure that we continue to fill that pot, because as you say, proportionally, it's, you know, I think everyone's pleased that it's there, but it is a drop in the bucket to the need. It kind of goes back to some of the themes I was outlining in my remarks. Will we have the money? I think there's no question that the need is well known. So I think some of that will come down to how do these priorities around what we're going to put in broadly the housing bucket, which includes tenant protections, how much of that can be set aside for this, but I know there will continue to be a push.
I would just further stress that when we see billions attempting to be spent on homelessness services and shelter,
Stopping the outflow might be a good.
stopping the outflow might be a great idea.
Yeah.
And a lot cheaper.
Yes.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Commissioner Trosas?
Well, it is cheaper to keep someone in their existing housing than build new housing at $800,000 a door. But in any event, a couple of questions. Is there a way that we can establish like a statewide right to counsel? Is that something that anyone has an appetite for? That's something that we've talked about with United to House LA and the city of LA. Obviously something we're looking at the county. You know, what would we have to do to get this statewide?
Right. There have been, as I know you're aware, conversations at the state level on this for many years. There have been proposals in the past. Those have ultimately been narrowed to sort of pilot projects
Right.
that I think you're aware of, the Shriver project, for example. So that's an ongoing, continued part of the conversation as well, right? Much in the same way that Constitution guarantees a right to representation in a criminal case. I think there's a growing conversation about the loss of your housing. Should there be some baseline support when that is on the line? So I suspect we will continue to see those conversations happening. I come back to my earlier sort of themes of, you know, where is this new legislature? I don't think we know yet on these kinds of questions. So I suspect, though, that we will continue to see that push.
And then on the fair chance rental legislation, what likelihood does that have of proceeding
I think we're
in
going to
the
see
next
that
session?
again,
Yeah.
referring to the policy regarding criminal background checks and that being used to exclude people, giving an opportunity to explain a negative mark in that regard. That bill has been introduced a number of times now. It's got to the second house this time before dying. So I know that many of the groups who have been working on that issue that are trying to create more opportunity for justice-involved tenants that are likely to push that again. I suspect we will see that bill again this
Yeah, and I would love to see this board support that. Sorry, one more question. And then with La Casa, I know that Housing California was opposed to La Casa, but the city of Santa Monica, and I'm talking about Comwater's bill.
79,
Yeah, the LA County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency. Can you just tell us, because I'm confused on like the county, the city using like a local financing mechanism, quote unquote. How was it portrayed in Sacramento that we would actually generate revenue for La Casa? Like tax increment financing, redevelop, like I'm not super clear on how we generate revenue. Like it sounds great, but is there money
I
for
was
it?
hoping you could tell me that.
Okay. Well, I don't know if it's like, oh, we're going to take some Measure H, we're going to take some of this potentially United to House LA if it passes. The problem is I still see this recurring problem that the governor continues to want to have local jurisdictions solve these housing problems by, you know, entitling things by right. And that's fine, but we're still not getting resource. Like, I'm not clear where the actual dollars are coming
All right.
from.
Well, my understanding is it would create additional resources by giving a new authority to generate revenue.
Okay.
A little, I have to admit, not steeped in the details on what exactly, how that,
Yeah, I'm just curious, like genuinely curious, how do you generate that revenue?
yeah.
Okay. Well, hopefully we can figure it out and get some money for Santa Monica. Thanks.
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie, go ahead.
Okay, for AB 2203 and for the Eggman, is there any way that we can breathe any life back into these dead issues?
2203, is that, now I've forgotten the numbers, but that's.
2203. Loose
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah,
advocating
that
for
was
that
something
for
I touched
years.
on in my, something I touched in my opening. I think there's a lot of interest. We had 3 or 4 bills in that area this year alone, the Eggman bill, Los Orchidius, one other member, Silva. So I suspect we will see at least one more attempt at that. There's growing recognition that, having to have a gold-plated credit report or a completely clean rental history is a growing impediment for folks to access housing. I think we'll see more bills.
This is one of the keys to reversing homelessness.
Yes,
These 2 bills right here.
agreed.
Okay, anyone else?
Wait, sorry, I also think that people need to stop doing source of income discrimination when people with vouchers are trying to rent units, because that's leading to criminalizing poverty. All right, unsolicited opinion.
All right, Mr. Augusta, thank you for making the trip down. We really
Thank you.
appreciate seeing you.
Yes, nice to see you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Okay, moving on to item 12B, litigation update. Council, do we have a report?
Yeah. Good evening. Good to see you all. So there have been a number of important cases that have been published this year. I just wanted to highlight 3 of them for you that affect our jurisdiction in particular. The first one was published in January of this year, 2022. This was out of San Francisco. This was a lawsuit filed against the city and county of San Francisco based on an ordinance that they have which prohibits a bad faith rent increase in order to unlawfully evict a tenant. And bad faith rent increase is defined as a substantially large rent increase that is above market rates for comparable units, for example, or a rent increase that is imposed within 6 months of another effort to recover possession of the unit. And so the San Francisco Apartment Association sued on the grounds that it was preempted by Costa-Hawkins. Costa-Hawkins, as you'll recall, exempts new construction and other properties from rent regulations. And so they were arguing that this ordinance was a regulation of the rents in violation of Costa-Hawkins. The court found that it was not a regulation of the rent, it was actually a regulation on the grounds of eviction, and to prevent landlords from getting around the just cause protections by using these bad faith rent increases. The court found that these rent increases were not actually intended by the landlord to be collected as rent, but instead were a tool to drive the tenant out of the unit. And so this is a really important distinction that the court made and gives another tool in the toolbox to prevent these unlawful evictions. It's not something that Santa Monica has utilized just yet, but it certainly is something that we should be looking at.
Is this in rent-controlled units or non-rent controlled units? Because rent control would seem to have.
Correct. These are exempt
Okay.
units. So these would otherwise be lawful rent increases, but because they were so exorbitant, they were determined to be bad faith rent increases. Correct. The second case that is of interest is one out of Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles. This was called Cameron versus Los Orchidius Properties. This was a lawsuit brought by Erin Cameron, who was over 80 years old and had lived in her unit for 52 years when she was evicted through the Ellis Act. And then the property owner within 2 years turned right around and re-rented her unit. Under the Ellis Act, she was supposed to get the right of return, and the owner refused and instead paid her the $6,000 in punitive damages and said that that was all the owner had to do. They could decide whether to offer her the unit back or pay her the damages. Ms. Cameron sued the owner, and not only sued for wrongful eviction, but brought a case under the Financial Elder Abuse Act. And she argued that Ellis required, it wasn't an option for the owner to decide whether to offer her unit back or pay damages. It was both. So the court found in Ms. Cameron's favor, and the appeals court held that, yes, the Ellis Act requires the owner to both reoffer the unit to the former tenant and pay punitive damages if it's re-rented within those 2 years.
I recall with our previous general counsel a couple of years ago that this case or a similar case we were advised of it as well.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Right. So why is there still a case if legislation was changed a couple of years ago
Right, so.
regarding this exact thing?
So this case would have predated that amendment. But the court did find that even before this amendment, there was still you couldn't extinguish that obligation simply by paying the rent. So it essentially said the amendment clarified what was already the law. And the other important thing to note is that the court also held that under the Financial Elder Abuse Statute, this obligation to reoffer the unit to the former tenant is a property right. And so therefore, the owner violated the property right under the Financial Elder Abuse Statute, which entitled the tenant to not just economic damages, non-economic damages, and punitive damages. In this case, the non-economic damages awarded were $250,000. The punitive damages awarded were $250,000, and she was awarded attorney's fees. So as you can imagine, this could prove to be a very large deterrent and give us one more little tool to make sure that the Ellis Act is enforced and adhered to the way it's supposed to be. The final case I want to bring to your attention is.
Wait, sorry, and that was City of LA?
Yes, City of Los Angeles.
Great.
The last case I want to bring to your attention is one that our own Haka Mordezai litigated on our behalf. This is a published appellate decision in Hirschfield versus Cohen. And this involved 4 units that had been built to replace rent-controlled units that had been withdrawn and then demolished. Those 4 replacement units were then re-rented within 5 years, which means under the Ellis Act, they are also subject to rent control. So one of those units had been rented to Ms. Cohen, and Ms. Cohen received an unlawful rent increase. She petitioned to the board, to the rent control agency. We held a hearing, and it was determined that these units were covered by rent control. There was a settlement agreement reached, and then a lawsuit was filed to go directly, they bypassed you all, to go directly to the courts. And the appellate court held that yes, these units are covered by rent control. The landlord was arguing that these units were not subject to rent control because that provision, because they were single-family homes, and were exempt, that would otherwise be exempt under Costa-Hawkins, that provision of Ellis did not apply to these particular units. The court said no, that because these were new accommodations as defined in the Ellis Act, and because the Ellis Act serves a different purpose than Costa-Hawkins, the purpose of the Ellis Act is to prevent these types of end runs around the rent control law, that the court could harmonize the statute and find that the Ellis provision works as an exception to Costa-Hawkins. And so therefore, these units and other units like it throughout the state, because this is an appellate decision, are covered under rent control. And Haka did an amazing job. I want to congratulate him for his work on that.
Published.
And that concludes my report. Thank
Wait,
you.
I have a question about Hirschfield v. Cohen. How did the individual it's Mrs. Cohen, right? No, Mrs. Hirschfield.
Cohen is the tenant.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. How did Ms. Cohen figure out that she was under rent control?
So
Like, would these people have gone unnoticed, but for like this tenant sleuthing around and figuring this out?
yeah, I think what happened, and Haka can correct me if I'm wrong, is when the units were back, were back online, when they were re-rented, were we notified? I think we sent her a letter. I feel like the agency sent both the owner and the tenant a letter.
What I understand actually was that it was the repetitive, like within 1 year, the owner tried to raise the rent several times, and or it was the amount that was exceptional compared, because she was already paying $5,000, and this is, we're talking about like 10 years ago, right? So quite a bit back then, and then it compelled her to just check with the rent board exactly what's going on. And that's when, because the kind of the ironic thing is, the landlord under Ellis, if you have a new construction and if you don't rent the new construction until after 5 years have lapsed from the withdrawal date, then it's free and clear from rent control going forward. The landlord rented the unit to Ms. Cohen 3 months shy of the 5 years. And
That's
so
on him.
and then so when the issue was brought to our attention, then we investigated and found out that that's in fact the case, and then that's how it began.
Yeah, I just wonder, from a policy perspective, if we're losing these units to Ellis and then folks are bringing them back online before the 5-year period, like, do we have any sort of better compliance mechanism to make sure that the original tenants are either being offered their unit back at the rent they were paying, or that we're actually subjecting them to rent control? Like, are we I thought we were monitoring this. That's why I was just
As
surprised.
a courtesy through other
Right.
departments in the
I'm
city.
kind of surprised.
We
I
were
hope
signing off, right, on reoccupancy permits?
Maybe it's not as easy as
Karen?
we thought.
Yes, we do monitor the properties that were Ellised, and we track if a building permit's issued, and then we see when is a certificate of occupancy issued. And if it's within the 5 years, then it depends upon whether or not they offer it for rent.
I would think so. You can't really tell if they're not telling you when they do that, and they could be lying.
Or find the ad?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting, okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. We are now moving on to item number 16, which is adjournment. Before we do that, I want to notify everybody that the next regular meeting of the Rent Control Board will be November the 10th, 2022 at 7 p.m. here in the council chambers. Okay, I'll entertain a motion.
Can I just ask for something before we adjourn? I don't know if for our next meeting. So if you recall, we went to council with a series of ballot initiatives, one of which was this potential concept around the rent registry. It was decided at that point that we didn't need to actually put anything on the ballot, that city council could decide of their own volition to create a rental registry. And I would just love an update at our next meeting with potential, maybe we can talk further and like flesh this out, but I don't want too much time to wait before we start the work on that. Because there was a commitment made to this board that city staff would work on that. And that's how I understood it. And so I just want to know how we're going to meaningfully implement that going forward, now that we're talking about enforcement and making sure that we know where everyone is, and making sure that in addition to Ellis, we're enforcing our short-term rental laws, et cetera. Would love to have, that's fun, on November 10th, an update, and maybe we can talk about how exactly we curate that update. Thanks.
Okay, anything else?
I move we adjourn.
There's a first. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Gonska. Okay, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Leslie.
Yes.
Couldn't hear you.
Leslie
Sorry,
is what you
Commissioner
said.
Leslie,
Yes.
Commissioner Torosis,
Yes.
Commissioner Gonska,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
Chair Duran.
Yes.
Is
thank-
that the one we used to do by acclamation? Yeah, next time we don't have to do roll call on that one.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
I knew there was